The winter of 1888 came to the Idaho Territory, the way debt comes to a man who has borrowed too much quietly at first, then all at once. By the middle of October, the peaks above Sawtooth Hollow had already gone white. The lower ridges held on to the last of their color, brown and rust, in a gray that was almost purple in the early morning light. But everyone who had spent more than one season in that country knew what was coming. The birds knew it. The elk knew it. The men and women of Coldridge Timber Camp knew it too, even if most of them were too tired by the end of each day to think about much beyond the next morning's work. Coldridge sat in a long fold of mountain land between two ridges, sheltered enough from the worst winds, but never truly warm. The main buildings ran in a rough line, the mess hall at the center, the bunkhouses to the east, the equipment sheds and storerooms to the west, and at the far end, set slightly apart from everything else, the camp office where Edmund Voss kept his records. Edmund Voss had built Coldridge over 17 years. Not with his hands particularly. Edmund was not a man who worked with his hands if he could help it. He built it the way certain men build things, with contracts and debt ledgers and a patience that looks like kindness until you need something from it. He was 54 years old that autumn, lean and straight-backed, with pale eyes that gave nothing away regardless of what his mouth was doing. He wore the same dark coat every day, kept his accounts in a leather-bound book he carried everywhere, and ran Coldridge Timber Camp the way a watchmaker runs a shop, precisely, quietly, with the absolute conviction that every moving part existed to serve the mechanism, not the other way around. The mechanism worked because people believed they could not survive without it. That was the thing about Edmund Voss. He never needed to raise his voice. He never needed to threaten anyone directly. The debt book did that work for him. When a man owed 2 seasons of wages against the cost of his housing and food and tools, he did not make trouble. When a family's winter ration depended on continued employment, they did not ask difficult questions. Edmund had learned early that the most durable kind of control is the kind that feels like protection. People who believe they are being sheltered do not examine the walls of the shelter too closely. Clara Ashwood had understood this for a long time. She just had not yet found a way out of it. She was 20 years old that October, though she carried herself with the careful stillness of someone older. Not because life had beaten her down, though it had tried, but because stillness was a skill she had taught herself the same way she had taught herself everything else. One careful step at a time, one problem at a time, one number at a time. Her parents had died of fever 4 years earlier on the trail into Idaho Territory, 2 weeks short of the homestead they had spent everything to reach. Clara had buried them in ground she did not own, gathered what she could carry, and walked the remaining distance to the nearest settlement. Coldridge Timber Camp was not what she had been looking for. It was what was there. She signed a labor contract in exchange for food, shelter, and a wage that went almost entirely toward the debt her parents had left behind. Edmund had explained the terms clearly, which she appreciated in a grim sort of way. He had not pretended it was anything other than what it was. In that narrow sense, at least, he was more honest than most. For 4 years, Clara had cooked meals, managed inventory, tallied supply records, and kept the careful accounts that Edmund relied on but rarely acknowledged. Her mother had been a school teacher before the westward move, and she had passed along enough arithmetic to make Clara genuinely useful. What her mother had not been able to pass along was the understanding of what usefulness without power actually costs a person. The way being needed and being valued are 2 entirely different things, and the distance between them can feel like a canyon when you are standing on the wrong side. Clara knew every shelf in the Coldridge storeroom. She knew the weight of a full flour sack versus a half-empty one, and she could tell by the feel of a bag whether someone had been skimming from the top. She knew which suppliers shorted their deliveries and which could be trusted. She knew the debt totals of every worker in camp, not because she was supposed to, but because the numbers passed through her hands, and numbers had a way of staying with her. She knew things she was not supposed to know. She kept them to herself. In Coldridge, the word of an indentured worker carried less weight than the word of a landowner's son, and Clara had no illusions about where she stood in that arrangement. Marvel Holt understood this as well as anyone. She was a widow in her late 40s, a laundress who had come to Coldridge 3 years earlier after her husband died of a chest infection, and she had the look of a woman who had spent a long time making peace with difficult realities. She and Clara did not talk much. In a place where every conversation could be overheard and every small act of generosity could be noted and held against you, friendship had to be conducted carefully. Marvel showed her care the way practical people show everything, quietly and through action. Clara had once come back from a late supply count to find a torn sleeve on her work coat neatly mended and folded on her bunk. She never mentioned it. Neither did Marvell. Elston Crane had been at Coldridge for only one season, hired to teach reading and arithmetic to the children of camp workers through the winter months. He was a careful, observant man in his mid-30s with the look of someone who had spent a great deal of time around books and not quite enough time around people who disagreed with him. He was not unkind. He had the brand of intelligence that sometimes mistakes observation for action and watching for wisdom. He noticed things. He wrote them down in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. He had not yet learned that noticing something and doing something about it are not the same thing. He noticed, for instance, that Mason Voss had a habit of avoiding certain parts of the camp in the evenings. He noticed that Mason's mood turned sharp and restless whenever supply wagons arrived. He noticed that Mason never quite looked directly at Clara when they were in the same room. He wrote these things down. He said nothing. Mason Voss was 25 years old and had the handsome, uncomplicated face of a man who had never been required to develop character because other things had always filled the space where character might have grown. He was his father's son in the sense that he understood how power worked, but he lacked his father's patience and his father's discipline. Where Edmund used debt to control people, Mason used charm, and where charm failed him, he used the simple fact of who his father was. He gambled. He had always gambled. It was the one area of his life where he seemed genuinely animated, not the money exactly, but the sensation of possibility, the brief electric feeling that everything could change in the turn of a card. It almost never did, of course. The feeling was the addiction. The losses were just the cost of chasing it. By October of 1888, Mason Voss was in serious trouble. On the 14th day of that month, a man named Harlon Dyer rode into Coldridge Timber Camp just before midday. He was the foreman of a mining operation called Silver Creek, which ran a dig site about 20 miles north and east of Coldridge, in a valley that caught snow even earlier than the main camp. He was a broad, deliberate man of about 50, with a gray-streaked beard he kept neatly trimmed and the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades looking at things carefully before deciding what to do about them. Harlon Dyer was passing through. His mining crew had finished their last productive week before the winter shutdown, and he was carrying their wages in a walnut payroll box 18 inches long, fitted with an iron handle and a brass lock, along with a quantity of stamped company script that the men could use at the Silver Creek commissary when operations resumed in spring. 32 men's wages, everything they had earned since August. His plan had been to continue south to the valley settlement, where he could arrange for the money to be held properly until the roads reopened after spring thaw. But the weather had turned faster than expected, and his horse had picked up a stone bruise 2 days back and needed rest. Coldridge was the most substantial camp on this stretch of mountain road. He found Edmund Voss in the camp office, explained the arrangement plainly, and Edmund accepted without hesitation. The box would be kept in the locked office overnight. Harlon would continue south in the morning when his horse had rested. Clara was in the supply room adjacent to the office when this conversation happened. She heard it through the wall as she was counting lamp oil reserves. She registered it the way she registered most things, noted it, filed it, moved on. A payroll box. One night. Edmund's locked office. She thought nothing more of it. She did not know that Mason Voss, standing outside the office window on his way to the equipment shed, had also heard every word, and that what he heard had caused something to shift in his thinking the way a key turning in a lock causes a mechanism to realign. That evening, Harlon Dyer ate supper in the mess hall with the camp workers, answered questions about the Silver Creek operation with the patience of a man who has answered the same questions many times and turned in early. His horse needed rest. So did he. The card game started in the back of the equipment shed around 9 o'clock. The way card games at Coldridge always started quietly without announcement, with the understanding that it was not officially happening. Mason Voss sat down at the table with 2 teamsters who were waiting out the weather before continuing their freight run south. They were experienced card players. Mason was not, though he had never fully accepted this about himself. By midnight, Mason had lost more than he had. The 2 teamsters wanted their money before sunrise. They were not violent men, but they were not patient ones either, and they made it clear that if Mason could not pay in coin by dawn, they would feel obligated to discuss his debts with his father in considerable detail. Mason sat outside the equipment shed after the game ended in the cold and the dark and thought about his options. They were not good options. They were the options a man generates when he has already eliminated all the better ones through a long series of smaller choices that seemed manageable at the time. He sat there for a long time. Then he got up and walked to the camp office. Edmund kept the spare office key on a hook behind the right side of his desk. Clara knew this because she had used it twice herself, both times with permission to access supply records when Edmund was away from camp. The hook was not hidden. There had never been a reason to hide it. Coldridge ran on the assumption that trust was enforced by the ledger, not by locks, and that anyone who violated that trust would face consequences serious enough to deter the impulse. The assumption had been correct until now. Mason moved quickly and without hesitation, which suggested he had thought this through more carefully than his usual impulsiveness would imply. He retrieved the key. He unlocked the office. He located the walnut payroll box on the shelf where Edmund had placed it. He carried it out of the office, relocked the door, and walked across the dark camp to the old weighing shed at the western edge of the property. The weighing shed had not been in regular use for 2 seasons. The floor was thick with dust and the smell of old iron. Mason found the loose board he had known about since boyhood, the way young men who grow up in camps know every hiding place by the time they are 12, and pried it up with a short iron bar he had brought from the equipment shed. Beneath it was a space about 18 inches deep, running between 2 floor joists. He placed the payroll box in the space. He worked the lid partially, not enough to break the brass lock, but enough to access the interior through a gap at one corner, and removed a quantity of silver coins. Not all of them. Enough to cover what he owed the teamsters with a margin. He worked by the light of a small shielded lamp, and when he was done, he replaced the board as cleanly as he could manage. Then he reached into his coat pocket and removed a single piece of Silver Creek script, a small rectangle of printed paper worth $1 at the company commissary, the kind of thing that could have come from anywhere, and that meant nothing by itself, but would mean a great deal in the right context. He crossed the camp to the women's bunkhouse. Clara's coat hung on the peg by her bunk, as it always did. Her sewing kit sat on the small shelf above. Mason opened the kit, placed the script beneath a spool of thread, and closed it again. He was outside and moving back toward the main bunkhouse inside of 40 seconds. Clara slept through all of it. She was 12 feet away. The morning came gray and cold with the flat light that makes everything look like it is waiting for something to happen. Harlon Dyer was preparing to leave when Edmund came out of the office with his face arranged in the careful, neutral expression he wore when something had gone wrong and he was deciding how to respond. The payroll box was gone. The office lock showed no damage. The spare key was still on its hook. Within an hour, the camp was awake and gathered in the mess hall. Mason spoke first. He had seen Clara near the office the previous night, he said. He had thought nothing of it at the time. He was sorry he had not mentioned it sooner. He delivered this with the practiced ease of a man who has spent years watching his father manage rooms full of people, and he said it just quietly enough to sound reluctant rather than rehearsed. A search followed. It was Edmund who suggested they begin with the workers' personal quarters, and it was Edmund who personally accompanied the 2 men who searched the women's bunkhouse. Clara stood in the doorway and watched. She did not object. She had nothing to hide. When they opened her sewing kit and found the Silver Creek script, the room went very quiet. Clara looked at the small piece of paper in Edmund's hand. She understood what had happened with the clarity that comes to people who are good with numbers and the logic of cause and effect. She understood it completely and instantly, and she felt the ground shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the floor beneath her feet. She did not cry. She had decided long ago that crying in front of Edmund Voss was something she would not do. The proceeding, if it could be called that, was held in the mess hall that same morning. Every worker in camp was present. Harlon Dyer stood near the front. Elston Crane stood near the back wall with his notebook in his coat pocket and his hands very still at his sides. Marvel Holt stood beside the washing tub she had been working at when the call went out, and she had come still holding a piece of wet canvas because there had not been a moment to put it down. Edmund stood at the head of the room. Clara stood alone in the center. Edmund presented the facts as he chose to present them, which amounted to the same thing as understanding them in a room where he was the authority. The payroll box was missing. Script from that box had been found in Clara Ashwood's sewing kit. A witness had placed her near the office the previous night. The office lock showed no signs of forced entry, which suggested, and here Edmund paused in a way that was itself a kind of verdict, that the person responsible had access to the spare key. He did not say she was guilty. He did not need to. The structure of what he said accomplished the same thing with more efficiency and less accountability. Clara spoke clearly. She did not raise her voice. She asked 3 questions. The brass lock on the office door showed no damage. If she had taken the spare key, used it to enter the office, and replaced it afterward, then the presence of the key on its hook proved nothing either way. But if the key had not been forced, then the lock itself should show evidence of picking or tampering. It did not. Who had examined the lock for signs of picking? No one answered. The second, the office had a window facing the equipment yard. The ground outside that window was soft from recent rain. Had anyone examined the ground for footprints before the traffic of the morning search disturbed them? Edmund said the ground had been checked. He did not say what had been found there or not found. The third, the spare key had been on its hook when the theft was discovered. Edmund had said so himself. If she had used it, she had returned it. If she had returned it, she had been inside the office twice, once to take the box, once to return the key. Had anyone considered whether that account of events was more complicated than the simpler alternative that someone else had used the key and returned it? The room was quiet. Clara watched Edmund's face while she asked these questions, and she watched Harlon Dyer's face, and she watched Mason Voss standing behind his father's right shoulder with one hand buried deep in his coat pocket. She had worked around numbers long enough to know when a figure had been placed where it did not belong. She knew the look of a column that had been adjusted to produce a predetermined result. She looked at Mason's coat pocket. The hand inside it was pressing against the fabric in a way that suggested something underneath, fingers pressing down, covering something, the unconscious gesture of a man protecting the evidence of his own work. At the edge of his cuff, where the coat sleeve had ridden up slightly, she could see the marks of abrasions along the heel of his hand, the kind left by rough wood and the edge of an iron tool used for prying. She looked at Elston Crane. He was looking at Mason's coat pocket too. Their eyes met for one moment across the crowded room. Elston looked away first. Harlon Dyer looked at the script in Edmund's hand. He looked at Clara. He looked at the room full of people who were all watching Edmund for the signal that would tell them how to respond. The three questions she had asked sat in the air of the room unanswered. He felt the wrongness of them being unanswered. He felt it clearly, the way a man with his experience feels when a set of numbers doesn't reconcile. He chose the easy explanation anyway. It was a choice he would have to live with, and in the months that followed he would think about it often, turning it over in his mind the way a man turns over a stone that he already knows has something unpleasant beneath it. Edmund tore the labor contract in half. He placed both pieces on the table in front of Clara. The debt ledger stayed where it was because the debt did not disappear with the contract. That was how the mechanism worked. She no longer belonged in Coldridge, but somehow she still owed Coldridge. She had until sunset. Marvel Holt moved first. She crossed the room to where her husband's old coat hung on a peg by the door. A heavy canvas-lined coat that she had kept because it was the warmest thing she owned and because she could not bring herself to give it away. She had been carrying it to the mess hall that morning with the specific intention of giving it to Clara before she left. She lifted it from the peg. Edmund said without turning around that anyone who assisted a proven thief could expect to find their own winter ration reconsidered before the first snowfall. Marvel stopped. The coat hung from her hands. She stood very still for a moment, in the way that people stand when they are deciding something that will cost them regardless of which way they decide. Then she stepped back. The coat stayed with her. Clara walked out of the mess hall with the blanket from her bunk, a tin cup, the dull kitchen knife she used for cooking, what remained of a loaf of barley bread, and the clothes she was wearing. No one followed. Clara stood for a moment in the yard outside the mess hall. The western sky had already turned the color of old pewter. The logging road ran south 14 miles to the nearest settlement. She had walked it twice before in good weather and daylight without a storm building. She calculated the hours of light remaining and the distance and the state of the road, and arrived at a number she did not like. Then she looked back at the mess hall once, at the closed door at the windows, where she could sense the presence of the people inside who had watched and said nothing, and she said the three questions quietly to herself, not with bitterness, but with precision, the way she would note a discrepancy in a ledger. 3 questions, no answers. That told her everything she needed to know about what she was leaving. She turned and walked south. The rain came before dark, cold and driving, the kind of rain that is already thinking about becoming something worse. The road turned to mud under her boots. Wind came off the mountain gaps carrying that sharp mineral scent that people in this country had learned to recognize, the smell of a storm, assembling itself out of air and altitude and physics. At a fork in the road, a fallen pine blocked the lower road completely. The trunk was 4 feet through at the base, and it had come down hard, taking smaller trees with it. There was no way around it on the low side. Clara looked up the slope. No trail. Loose rock above the tree line, spruce below it, everything wet and darkening. She looked back at the blocked road. She looked at the light remaining. Then she looked up the slope again. She climbed. She moved the way she had learned to manage everything else in her life carefully, without wasted motion, conserving energy, the way she conserved lamp oil and flour, and the small coins that almost never accumulated to anything meaningful. She used tree trunks as windbreaks when the gusts came hard. She drank from water running over stone rather than kneeling at a pooled stream where the ground was soft. She kept the remaining bread tucked beneath her dress, where the warmth of her body would keep it from freezing solid. Her hands began losing feeling after the second hour. Her legs were wet to the knee and growing heavier with every step. The cold worked at her concentration the way a creditor works at a debt steadily without malice, simply collecting what the conditions entitled it to collect. She did not stop. Then somewhere beyond the black mass of the spruce forest to her right, she heard it. Water. Deep and continuous, striking stone with the authority of great height. Not a stream. A fall. 4 years ago in the Coldridge storeroom, going through a stack of old supply records and survey notes that no one had looked at in years, she had found a hand-drawn notation on a piece of oilcloth. Rough lines indicating terrain water sources, possible shelter locations. Marked in faded ink in the corner water, plus stone plus shelter, northeast of Raven. She had studied it for a few minutes, then filed it back where she found it. Not because it was useless, because she had no immediate need for it. She had memorized the shape of those notations without knowing she was doing it, the way she memorized everything that passed through her hands. She turned toward the sound of the water, not because she felt hope exactly, because it was the only direction left that was not simply lying down, and lying down was not something Clara Ashwood intended to do on a mountainside in October with people back at Coldridge who had not yet seen what she was capable of. Ravenfall dropped nearly 50 feet from a black basalt ledge into a stone basin below. Even in this season, before the deepest cold had taken full hold, the edges of the fall were beginning to lace with ice. The spray hit the surrounding rock and froze where it landed, coating everything in a thin, treacherous shell. Clara stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at it for a long time. The water did not cling entirely to the cliff. Near the right side of the fall, where the rock face jutted outward at a natural angle, there was a gap not large, not obvious, but there. A dark space behind the curtain of moving water, where an overhang of stone created a pocket of sheltered air. Getting there would require crossing 30 feet of ice-coated rock and failing light with hands that were not fully responding to instruction. She cut a pine branch and used it to test each step before she committed her weight. She moved sideways, facing the rock, feeling for holds with fingers she could barely feel. She slipped once on a moss-covered shelf and caught herself against the stone. She slipped again 4 steps later and nearly lost the knife at her belt. She pressed herself flat against the rock for a moment, breathing, then continued. Behind the waterfall was a crack in the rock face, 3 feet and 8 inches high, less than 2 feet wide. Cold air drifted from inside, carrying the scent of dry earth, old ash, and something older, something that suggested human presence from a time long past. Clara pushed her wet blanket through the opening ahead of her. She dropped to her knees. She turned sideways and pressed herself into the darkness. The passage climbed at a shallow angle for more than 30 feet. After the first few yards, the stone beneath her hands was dry. The roar of the falls faded into a deep vibration she felt more than heard, a resonance that seemed to come from the mountain itself rather than from any single source. The passage opened into a stone chamber. She could feel the space around her change, the echoes of her breathing, returning from further away, the shift in air pressure that told her the ceiling was higher and the walls further apart. She reached into her coat for the tin cup she had been given, which she was using to carry the few matches she owned wrapped in a strip of oilcloth. Her fingers found something else first. Small, metal, a box. She worked slowly in the darkness. The box was a tinderbox, old and dented, sitting on a ledge at approximately shoulder height. Inside, beneath her fingertips, she found dry bark and a piece of flint. It took 7 attempts. On the 8th, the bark caught. The flame was small and uncertain, but it was enough. In its light, Clara Ashwood looked at what the mountain had held in trust. A stone hearth, smoke blackened from decades of use. Stake holes in the floor where structures had once stood. Elevated storage shelves, rough but deliberately constructed. Rotting basket fragments. 5 rolled hides, 3 ruined by damp, 2 still serviceable. Small jars and crocks, most cracked or empty. A deerhide map covered in markings she could not read as language, but recognized as deliberate. Bone needles, a rusted trapper's knife worth salvaging, a small alcohol thermometer wrapped in oilcloth with the year 1879 carved into its case. And in the corner of the oilcloth, almost too faint to read, Emma November 1871. Someone had been here before. Not treasure, something better than treasure. A system left by people who had understood this mountain and worked out its rules over time and encoded that knowledge in symbols in the placement of objects. Some signs were old, very old, made by hands that had known this country long before Coldridge or any camp like it existed. Others were more recent. A trapper had added his own supplies, at some point, his own adjustments to existing knowledge. And someone else earlier. A November 1871 had been here in need as Clara was in need, and had learned what was learnable and left what she could. Clara was not alone in the deep sense of the word. She was the next person in a line she had not known existed until this moment. Much was gone. Much was broken. The tinderbox was low on supplies. The food stores, when she examined them by lamplight, were mostly spoiled. But 3 jars were sealed, and the air in this chamber was dry. And the stone walls held the heat of the small fire in a way that the open mountain would never permit. Clara took the charcoal from the edge of the fire where it had formed along a piece of half-burned wood. She found a section of wall that was flat and clean. She drew a line, then another. Columns, food, fuel, materials, repairs. She looked at the figures she was beginning to assemble. They were not good figures, but they were hers. Every number she had entered into Edmund Voss's ledgers for 4 years had belonged to Edmund Voss. Every tally she had made in the Coldridge storeroom had served Coldridge. These marks on this wall belonged to no one but her. For the first time in 4 years, the accounting she was doing was her own. Outside, beyond the frozen curtain of Ravenfall, the rain was becoming something harder. The temperature was dropping toward a number that would make the logging road impassable by morning. In the camp she had left 14 miles south and east, people were banking their fires and thinking about getting through the night. Clara set the tinder box on the highest shelf she could reach because things stored low belonged to dampness first. Then she sat down beside the small fire, picked up the broken bone needle she had found in the dust near the hearth, and set it carefully beside the flame. M.A. had learned these lessons here. Others before her had learned them. They had left what they could of that learning behind, and the mountain had held it in trust for whoever came next. She was here now. She reached for the charcoal and drew a single line on the wall beside her first column. Day 1. The second morning inside the mountain, Clara Ashwood made her first serious mistake. She had slept better than she had any right to expect. The 2 serviceable hides from the elevated shelf were stiff with age but dry, and she had layered them over herself with the blanket from Coldridge, and the stone chamber held enough residual warmth from the small fire that the cold became something manageable rather than something lethal. She woke in darkness, which meant nothing about the time, because darkness was the permanent condition of this place, and checked the thermometer. 41 degrees inside the chamber. 33 near the entrance passage. Outside, through the deep vibration of the falls, she could hear wind. She rebuilt the fire with the wood she had gathered the previous evening. Deadfall from the spruce forest below the falls carried up in 2 trips before the light had fully gone. The wood was not dry enough, but it was what she had. She fed the flame carefully the way she had learned to feed anything that needed to grow before it could be useful. That was when the smoke came down. It did not happen immediately. For the first several minutes, the fire behaved as a fire should, burning upward, consuming, producing heat in the modest but real way that a small fire in an enclosed space can produce heat. Clara began sorting through the remaining jars and crocks, assessing what could be salvaged. She opened the first sealed jar and found dried camas, root, and pine nuts, the top layer musty but the interior still viable. She set it aside and reached for the second. The smoke hit her eyes before she registered what was happening. It came in a wave, dropping from the ceiling in a gray curtain. In an open fire, in an open space, smoke rises and disperses. In an enclosed chamber with a compromised draft, smoke rises until it meets. Resistance spreads laterally, then descends. Within 30 seconds, Clara was coughing. Within a minute, she was on her hands and knees, moving toward the entrance passage, eyes streaming the fire she had built, producing poison as efficiently as it was producing warmth. She smothered it with damp soil from near the entrance and crawled into the passage until she could breathe. She sat in the narrow stone corridor for a long time, listening to the falls and the wind and the sound of her own breathing returning to normal. She was not hurt. She was not in immediate danger. But she had burned through a portion of her wood supply to produce nothing but a smoke-filled room, and she could not afford to repeat that failure. She thought about it the way she thought about a column of figures that did not balance. The error was in the system, not in the material. The fire itself was not the problem. Something in the way air moved through this chamber was not working correctly, and until she understood why, she could not safely use the one thing that would keep her alive through a winter at this altitude. She pulled a loose thread from the hem of her coat. She held it near the ceiling crack she had noticed above the hearth. The thread moved not toward the crack, but away from it. The draft was reversed. Cold air was entering from above and pushing smoke downward instead of drawing it up and out. The ventilation was blocked. The deerhide map had symbols she could not read as language, but could begin to interpret as logic. She had studied it through the previous evening by firelight, turning it in her hands, trying to understand the relationship between its markings and the physical space around her. Some symbols were clearly directional. Others seemed to indicate conditions. There was a winding line that began at a marking she had associated with the hearth and followed a path toward a shape that might represent a ridge or a high point. She had assumed this line indicated a travel route. Now, running her finger along it in the dim light from the entrance passage, she reconsidered. The line did not go outward from the chamber. It went upward within it. Behind the largest storage shelf set into the wall, at an angle she had not examined because the shelf itself was in the way, there was a gap in the stone. Not an entrance. A narrow vertical shaft less than 14 inches across, rising upward into darkness at roughly the angle the map's line suggested. The ventilation shaft, packed with the accumulation of years' roots grown through from above pine needles driven in by wind-compacted dirt, and near the top. From what she could determine by probing with a sapling pole, she found near the old stake holes something that felt like a bird's nest, dense and fibrous, and thoroughly blocking whatever draw the shaft had once provided. She worked for 3 hours. The sapling pole could reach most of the blockage, but not all of it. She fashioned a hook from spring steel found in the bottom of the tinderbox, lashed it to the pole with rawhide cords stripped from one of the ruined hides, and used it to pull debris down in sections. Twice she lost her footing on the stone shelf she was standing on. Once a cascade of packed material came loose all at once and covered her from the chest down. When she finally felt the shaft move, air a faint, steady exhalation against her upturned face. She stood very still and let herself feel it for a full minute before she climbed down. She rebuilt the fire differently. She burned a tight bundle of dry bark beneath the shaft opening, first a hot flame that sent a column of warm air upward to prime the draw. She waited while the air column established itself. Then she added wood to the hearth, small pieces first, watching the smoke. It trembled. It rose. It did not come back down. Clara leaned close to the hearth and watched for several minutes longer, because in this place patience was not a virtue. It was a survival requirement, the same as water and dry wood, and the willingness to learn from a mistake rather than simply endure it. Only when she was certain the draft was holding did she sit back and let herself be warm. Over the following 6 days, Clara rebuilt the chamber from the inside out. She did not try to heat the entire space. That was the first decision, and it was the right one. Heat is not made, it is kept. A large cold room fights every fire you build in it. A small warm enclosure multiplies the heat you generate. She used willow branches cut from the stand below the falls to build a low frame on the highest and driest section of the chamber floor. The 2 good hides became walls. A third hide trimmed of its molded edges with the salvaged trapper's knife became an outer layer. She left a gap of several inches between the layers because she had noticed in 4 years of managing a camp supply room that dead air holds warmth better than any single material, and a gap between 2 surfaces creates dead air. The drainage trench she cut along the low side of the chamber took half a day of work with the stone awl and a flat piece of shale used as a scraper. It was tedious, precise work, the kind that produces no visible result until it produces a very visible result. The morning after she finished it, a slow seep of meltwater that had been pooling imperceptibly near the storage area ran cleanly away from everything she needed to keep dry. She moved damaged materials closer to the ventilation passage where the moving air could work at them. She rebuilt collapsed supports with rawhide fastenings tied tight and allowed to dry in position, which contracted as they dried and produced joints that became stronger with time rather than weaker. Not everything worked. One hide rehung too close to the stone wall came back damp the next morning, not from rain or seepage, but from condensation, the stone itself radiating cold inward and drawing moisture from the air between. She rebuilt the configuration with a finger-width gap between the hide and the rock, and the problem did not recur. A storage shelf collapsed under the weight of a clay crock. She replaced it with a lighter wooden frame lashed with sinew that distributed the weight more evenly. Every failure was a data point. She recorded them on the wall alongside the successes, because a record that tracks only what works is not a record. It is a story someone is telling themselves. For heat, she warmed river stones in the fire and wrapped them in hide scraps to place beneath her bedding. She tested the system, methodically checking the thermometer at regular intervals and writing results in charcoal columns on the wall. On the seventh night, with the outside temperature reading 18 below zero, on the small gauge hung near the entrance, the sleeping enclosure held at 52 degrees using a single bundle of wood. She wrote it on the wall. Day 7, outside 18 below. Sleeping space 52. One bundle. Smoke clean. Hides dry. She looked at those numbers for a long time before she slept. 52 degrees is cold by most measures, but 52 degrees is survivable, and 18 below zero is not. And the distance between those two figures was a distance she had built herself with her own hands and her own reasoning out of materials that most people would have walked past without stopping. On the 8th day, Clara caught the first snowshoe hare. The deerhide map had a symbol she had interpreted as rabbit tracks. 3 marks in the distinctive splayed pattern of a hare moving at speed, placed near a section of the map she had matched to the willow stand below the northeast approach to the falls. She had set 3 snares on the 5th day using loops of rawhide sinew staked at the height and angle the map's adjacent notations seemed to suggest. The first 2 days produced nothing. 1 snare was disturbed, the bait gone, the loop dragged sideways without closing. She examined the configuration and identified the problem. The loop was positioned across too wide a section of open ground. A hare moving through had multiple paths and had simply walked around the loop rather than through it. She moved all 3 snares into narrower gaps in the willow growth places, where the brush forced a traveling animal into a single line of movement. She staked the loops lower, closer to the ground, at the height a hare moves rather than the height a human being instinctively positions things. On the morning of the 8th day, the 3rd snare held. Clara stood in the willow thicket and looked at it for a moment without moving. The hare represented something beyond protein. It represented confirmation that the map was readable, that the knowledge embedded in its symbols was accurate and applicable, that the people who had made this place had understood the mountain in ways that were still valid, still useful, and had survived being passed down through whatever chain of lives had ended with a deerhide map inside a stone chamber behind a frozen waterfall. She cleaned the animal, carefully separating meat from hide, from sinew, from bone, with more attention than the task strictly required. She saved the small amount of body fat. She cracked the leg bones for marrow. She stretched the hide on a willow frame to dry. She set 1 leg bone beside the hearth because bone properly worked becomes a tool, and tools were what she needed most. In Coldridge, she had been accused of taking what belonged to others. Here she was learning a different relationship with what she took, one that required her to honor it completely, to waste nothing, to understand that in a system with no surplus, everything that passes through your hands carries an obligation. She ate a small portion that evening and recorded the day's work on the wall. That same evening, for the first time since leaving Coldridge, Clara sat still beside the hearth without a task in her hands. She had been moving constantly for 8 days, planning, building, testing, adjusting, moving. The work had kept the other things at a distance, the way work does when it is necessary enough. But now the hare was cleaned and stored, and the snares were reset, and the fire was drawing cleanly, and there was a moment with nothing immediately required of her. She looked at the wall, at the columns in charcoal, at the bone needle she had found on the first night set in its notch, at the initials in the corner of the thermometer case. Emma, November 1871. She thought about 4 years of keeping records in a language that served someone else's interests. 4 years of numbers that meant Edmund Voss's profit, or Edmund Voss's control, or the maintenance of a system in which Clara Ashwood existed primarily as a useful component. 4 years of waking up every morning inside someone else's accounting of who she was and what she owed. The tears came without announcement, which was how they come to people who have been holding things at a practical distance for a long time. She did not fight them, and she did not perform them. She sat beside the fire in a chamber carved into a mountain that did not care who she was, and she let herself understand something that the work of the past 8 days had been quietly teaching her. She had never in 4 years at Coldridge been allowed to simply solve a problem for herself. Every problem she had solved had been in service of the mechanism. Here, every problem she solved served only her survival, and in solving them, she had discovered something about her own capacity that 4 years of useful but invisible labor had not been able to show her. She was not just useful, she was capable. Those are different things entirely. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, looked at the numbers on the wall, and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled in a long time. Then she picked up the charcoal and added a note to the Day 8 record that she had not originally intended to include. Not temperature, not fuel, just 4 words written smaller than the others in the corner of that day's entry. This belongs to me. She did not know what was happening at Coldridge. She could not know, but things were happening. Clem Briggs returned from his northern trap lines on the 11th day after Clara's expulsion. He was 65 years old, weathered to something close to permanent, with the careful economy of movement that comes to men who have spent decades in country that punishes carelessness. He had been trapping this mountain range for 30 years and knew its moods the way some men know a difficult horse, not with affection necessarily, but with the deep respect of long familiarity. He came into the Coldridge mess hall at midday, ate without ceremony, and mentioned in the offhand manner that men like Clem mentioned things that he had seen a thin ribbon of smoke rising from the cliff face near Ravenfall. Rising clean and straight, he said. Not steam, not a trick of mist off the ice. Smoke, and the kind of smoke that comes from a controlled fire in a well-drafted space. The room went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet. Edmund Voss said it was probably steam from thermal activity in the rock. He said this with the calm of a man presenting a reasonable alternative explanation, but his eyes moved briefly to Mason before they returned to Clem, and that brief movement did not go unnoticed by everyone present. Mason said too quickly that it was impossible. Clara could not have survived Ravenfall in that weather. The approaches were ice-covered. The rock face was treacherous even in good conditions. And even if she had somehow found shelter, she would have been without adequate food, without proper clothing, without any means of making fire. He said all of this with the particular urgency of a man who needs a conclusion to be true, rather than a man who has weighed the evidence and arrived at it. Elston Crane, sitting at the far end of the table, took out his notebook and made a mark in it. It was the only action available to him at that moment that he could justify to himself as useful, which was an accurate measure of how far he had yet to grow. Meanwhile, Harlon Dyer had been stranded at Coldridge by the early snowfall, the road south having closed faster than anyone had anticipated. With nothing to do but wait for the weather to break, he had spent several days doing what men with his training do when they have time and access to records, and something that does not sit right in the back of their mind. He had been looking at numbers. The numbers did not balance. The amount Edmund had recorded as Clara's supposed debt, the sum attributed to the missing payroll box, did not match the amount that Harlon knew to be missing from the Silver Creek account. The discrepancy was not enormous, but it was consistent, and it was consistent in a direction that suggested the recorded figure had been adjusted after the fact. The gap between what was actually gone and what Edmund had recorded as gone was being covered invisibly through adjustments to the camp's supply pricing. Flour, salt, lamp oil, each slightly higher than it had been in September, each increase small enough to pass unnoticed by workers who were not tracking the baseline prices, but collectively accounting for a sum that reconciled very precisely with the shortfall in the payroll box. Every worker in Coldridge was paying for the theft that Clara had not committed. Edmund had absorbed the loss into the operating costs of the camp and distributed it silently to the people least positioned to question it. Harlon sat with this knowledge for a long time. Outside the window of the room, he had been given the snow that had stranded him at Coldridge continued to fall. He had been a foreman for 30 years and had watched men make many kinds of mistakes. What he was looking at in these ledgers was not a mistake. A mistake happens once by accident, and the person who makes it does not immediately restructure the supply pricing to absorb and conceal the evidence of it. He closed his ledger and looked at the wall and thought about a young woman who had asked 3 specific questions in the mess hall and had not been given 3 specific answers. He had been standing in that room. He had felt the wrongness of those unanswered questions. He had chosen the convenient conclusion anyway. He opened the ledger and kept working because the only useful thing he could do at this point was ensure that when the time came, the numbers would be unambiguous. Edmund hired 2 loggers to accompany Mason to Ravenfall. Clem Briggs refused to guide them. Early winter ice around those falls, he said, could kill 3 men before they got anywhere near the rock face. He said this plainly and without apology, the way men who have seen people die in the mountains say things. Edmund removed Clem's credit at the camp store. Clem accepted this without visible reaction and went back to his cabin to think about his options. He had been in this country long enough to know several things that Edmund Voss did not. Mason reached Ravenfall on the 11th day. The climb went badly. The rocks were coated in layers of ice built up over several days of freeze-thaw cycles, and the 2 loggers he had brought were timber workers, not climbers. One slipped repeatedly on the lower approach. The other trapped his foot between 2 boulders halfway up and refused to continue further. Mason pushed on alone. He found the crack in the rock behind the falls. He pushed through it into darkness and found stone. Cold, dry stone and the faint smell of old ash, but no fire, no supplies, no evidence of recent occupation. What he did not find was the narrow passage at the rear of the chamber leading to the lower section of the system because he did not know to look for it. He did not find the blockage that Clara had constructed from loose stone and a forked branch leaving a gap near the floor, too small to notice and too regular to seem accidental. He stood in the empty chamber and held his lamp up and turned in a slow circle. He went back to the entrance and stood behind the frozen curtain of the falls and shouted into the darkness that no one from Coldridge would come looking for her once the real storm arrived. He said it with the force of a man who needs to believe what he is saying. He believed winter would finish what he had started. From behind the sealed junction, 30 feet away, lying flat against the stone, with her ear close to the small gap near the floor, Clara heard every word with the clarity that stone passages provide. She felt the cold breath of air moving through the gap against her cheek. She did not move until the light from his lamp had vanished and the sound of his movement through the entrance passage had faded entirely into the bass note of the falls. Then she lay there in the dark a while longer, just breathing. Not from fear, from the recognition that the man who had put her here had just told her without knowing it that no one was coming. Which meant she had only herself to rely on, which was, when she thought about it, not so different from the situation she had been in for the past 4 years. The difference was that now she knew it clearly. She got up and went back to work. 3 days after Mason's visit, Clem Briggs came alone. He did not follow the creek bed approach. He circled east along a ridge where the wind had scoured most of the snow away, moving at the steady, unhurried pace of a man who knows that arriving matters more than arriving quickly. He carried a small bundle salt wrapped in cloth, 2 pieces of wire for snares, a scrap of heavy canvas. He placed the bundle on the snow at the edge of the approach to the falls and stepped back. He waited. Claire had seen him from the ledge above the falls 20 minutes before he reached the bundle. She had watched his approach line the eastern ridge, the wind-scoured path, the deliberate avoidance of the obvious route, and understood immediately that this was not a man who had come to cause harm. Men who mean harm take the direct line. Men who are being careful take the long way around. She let him place the bundle. She watched him step back. She watched him turn as if to leave. Then she stepped out from the shadow of the rock outcropping where she had been standing. He stopped. He turned back. He looked at her with the trained eye of a man who reads landscape for information and people the same way. He took in the details the way a surveyor takes in terrain. The smoke from the vent shaft clean, straight, minimal. The absence of tracks on the obvious approach carefully erased. The willow frames near the lower entrance with hairskins stretched and drying. The way she was standing, not rigid with cold, not moving with the over-deliberateness of someone fighting hypothermia, but simply present in the way a person is present when they have organized their situation sufficiently that cold is a condition rather than a crisis. Work, he thought, not luck. He crossed the distance between them and handed her the bundle. She took it without making it into more than it was. He told her what was happening at Coldridge, Mason's visit, Edmund's reaction to the smoke report, the way Mason had insisted too quickly and too loudly that no one could have survived Ravenfall. He told her that Harlon Dyer had been stranded by the snow and had been very quietly doing something with the supply ledgers that he had not chosen to discuss with anyone. Then he told her about the weather. The pressure was dropping. Birds had been flying low for 2 days. The wind had begun shifting from north to northeast. A major storm was coming. Not the cold that had already passed. Something larger. Something that would decide a great many things. Clara did not ask how certain he was. She looked at the sky above the ridge to the northeast, the color of it, the texture, the way the clouds were moving, and she listened to the wind and looked at the snow on the exposed rock faces. Then she looked at Clem. He nodded once. That was confirmation enough. He moved with her toward the lower entrance, and inside the chamber he moved slowly, reading the space the way he read terrain. He touched the rawhide fasteners on the sleeping frame. He examined the drainage trench. He looked at the elevation of the storage shelves. He stood below the ventilation shaft and tilted his head and listened to the air moving through it. Then he stood at the deerhide map for a long time. The symbols were not entirely unfamiliar to him. 30 years ago, when he had first come to this territory, he had spent 2 winters among Shoshone hunters who had agreed to his presence in exchange for certain services, and they had taught him incidentally without ceremony, as people teach things when they are simply living, rather than instructing a great deal about how this mountain range worked. Not everything they knew. That would have taken a lifetime. But enough to recognize their method of encoding knowledge in visual form, the way terrain and season and resource were compressed into symbols that carried more information than they appeared to hold. He told Clara what he understood of the symbols. The wavy line near the circle, a year-round spring fed by subsurface water that maintained temperature even in deep winter, she had already found it. The 3 short marks beneath a slope ground where prevailing wind stripped the snow, leaving material accessible for foraging, she had already identified it. The double line running southeast, a winter passage negotiable even in heavy snowfall. If you knew the exact line, she had already noted it as a possible escape route. She had learned the map by testing each element against observable reality until the symbol and the terrain confirmed each other. She had done this alone in the dark, without anyone to tell her how. Clem stood looking at the charcoal records on the wall. He did not say he was impressed because he was not a man who performed reactions. He touched the day 7 entry. Outside temperature, sleeping enclosure temperature, wood consumed, draft quality, materials condition. He said quietly, the people who made this place would recognize what you are doing. Then he said the other thing. He said it without looking at her, facing the entrance. His voice matter-of-fact, the way serious warnings are matter-of-fact, from people who have seen what happens when they are not heeded. Mason would come back, not alone and not just to look. Clara was already thinking about the ventilation shaft adjustment Clem had suggested before he said the thing about Mason. She filed the warning in the same place she filed all useful information permanently, in the part of her mind that would surface it when she needed it. The storm arrived during the night between the 18th and 19th days. It did not build, it struck. Clara had spent the 2 days after Clem's visit making every improvement the system would accept. She widened a section of the lower passage that had been partially restricting airflow. She deepened the drainage channel 4 more inches at its outlet. She hung a second canvas baffle 18 inches inside the lower entrance, creating an air pocket between the outer opening and the chamber interior. She divided her tinder supply into 3 separate containers stored in 3 separate locations because a single point of failure in the tinder supply was a vulnerability she had time to address and therefore no excuse for leaving unaddressed. She moved a portion of the firewood deeper into the shelter. She lashed a long pole beside the ventilation passage positioned for clearing blockages without fully exposing herself. She ran a final test 2 hours before the storm hit outside, at 6 below zero sleeping enclosure, at 49 degrees, less than a full wood bundle consumed draft holding. She wrote it on the wall, left a line blank below it, and lay down. The storm came from the northeast as Clem had said it would, and it came with the ferocity of weather systems that have built over a long open stretch before meeting the first significant barrier. Everything the storm had gathered over 200 miles of open country arrived at these mountains simultaneously. Clara heard it hit. Even inside the stone, even behind 50 feet of passage and a frozen waterfall, she heard the change in sound. A deeper resonance. A pressure against the rock she felt rather than heard. The ventilation shaft sang at a different pitch. She got up and checked the shaft. Clear. She checked the lower entrance. The canvas baffle was holding. She checked the drainage outlet. Running. She rebuilt the fire with the precision she had developed over 18 days of practice, warming the shaft first, then adding wood in the sequence she had learned produced the cleanest and most sustained burn. The smoke rose and did not return. She wrapped the heated stones in hide and placed them under the sleeping enclosure. She ate a measured portion, recorded the consumption on the wall, and calculated how many more days her supplies could sustain her at current ration levels. 11 days, more if the snares continued to produce. She lay down inside the sleeping enclosure and pulled the hides over herself and listened to the storm work on the mountain outside. It was immense and indifferent and entirely without interest in her circumstances. It did not know she was innocent. It did not know she was 20 years old, or that she had built this warmth with her hands, or that 4 years of careful attention had led to this particular configuration of hides and stone and dry wood and managed fire. It simply ran its course, and she let it. On the 23rd day, the 14th day of the storm, Elston Crane arrived. She heard him before she saw him. A sound in the lower passage, not the vocabulary of ice or rock, or the mountain's normal internal movement, but something irregular and effortful, the sound of a person who had been moving for a very long time past the point where movement felt possible. She took the lamp and went to the passage entrance. He was on his hands and knees. His coat was frozen stiff. His face was a color that had no good name. Not quite blue, not quite gray, something between them that indicated a body withdrawing from its extremities to protect its core. His hands, when she pulled him inside, were rigid in a way that had nothing to do with will. Clara did not panic, and she did not hesitate. She did not place him near the fire. She wrapped him in the driest hide she had. She brought water from the spring, heated it to warm, not hot warm, and gave it to him in small amounts, tipping the cup against his lips and waiting for him to swallow before offering more. She packed the heated river stones around him, not against his skin, but near it inside the hide wrapping, so that the heat transferred gradually rather than suddenly. Rapid rewarming of a severely chilled body causes its own kind of crisis. Blood vessels dilating too quickly, cold blood from the extremities flooding the core. She had read this once in a medical reference among the survey papers in the Coldridge storeroom, and she had stored it without knowing she would need it the way she stored everything that passed through her attention. She worked on him steadily for 3 hours. He could not speak for the first hour. For the second, he managed occasional words. By the third, he was coherent enough to tell her that he had left Coldridge on the morning the storm struck its hardest, following the eastern ridgeline that Clem Briggs had mentioned in passing, to someone else guided by the thin thread of smoke he could see from the high ground above the main camp. He had nearly turned back 4 times. The 5th time he nearly turned back, he could no longer find the way he had come, which meant the only direction available to him was forward. Clara listened to this and said nothing. She was monitoring his color, his breathing, the degree of tremor in his hands, the rate at which sensation was returning. He looked at the wall, at the columns of charcoal figures, at the day count, at the meticulous record of temperatures and fuel consumption and system performance that covered 3 feet of stone surface in careful lines. He looked at the sleeping enclosure, the rawhide frame, the layered hides, the drainage trench, the elevated storage, the baffled entrance, the ventilation pole, the 3 separate tinder containers. He looked at all of it for a long time, while the storm pressed against the mountain, and the fire burned clean, and the air inside the sleeping enclosure held its warmth with the reliability of a system that had been tested against failure, and had learned from each failure, and had been rebuilt better each time. He said finally that everything Pine Spur, and he caught himself, because that was the name from a story he had half heard, not the name of this camp. Everything Coldridge had called luck looked different up close. Up close, it looked like work. Clara did not respond. She was checking the 3rd tinder container, which she had not opened in 2 days and wanted to verify was still dry. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, the fire burned. The smoke rose. The numbers accumulated on the wall 1 day at a time. Clara picked up the charcoal and drew another line. Day 23. The storm did not end. It relented. There is a difference. An ending is a clean thing, a door closing a final condition. What happened to the storm above Sawtooth Hollow over the course of the 24th and 25th days was something more gradual, a slow withdrawal of force the way a tide pulls back, not because it has decided to leave, but because the physics that drove it have temporarily shifted. The wind dropped from a roar to a sustained push. The pressure in the ventilation shaft eased. The sound inside the stone chamber changed from a deep, resonant compression to something lighter. Clara noted it without celebrating it. Celebration is a form of premature conclusion, and she had learned in 23 days of mountain living that premature conclusions cost more than the satisfaction they provide. She was near the hearth, working a length of rawhide through a series of loops to create a lashing strong enough to replace the one on her sleeping frame that had begun to fray when Elston Crane finally sat upright on his own without bracing himself against the stone wall. She had been watching for that threshold. She looked at him once, assessed what she saw, and returned to the rawhide. He looked at the wall. He had been looking at the wall intermittently since his first coherent hours. The charcoal columns covered a surface roughly 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, organized with a precision that spoke not of compulsion, but of habit. The habit of a person for whom numbers are a primary language, and recording them is as natural as breathing. Day counts, temperature readings internal and external taken at consistent intervals, wood consumption per night, food inventory updated daily, system performance notes, draft quality moisture levels, structural integrity, snare productivity, 23 days of data, a complete record of a system learning itself into reliability. He said her name. She looked up. He said he owed her an account of what he had seen and not reported on the second day. He said it plainly without preamble because he had spent 2 days unable to do much besides think, and he had arrived at the conclusion that the only honest way to begin was at the beginning. He had seen Mason Voss's hand inside his coat pocket during the proceeding in the mess hall. He had seen the way the fabric pressed outward, from fingers pressing inward, covering something. He had seen the marks at the edge of Mason's cuff abrasions, consistent with rough wood and the kind of iron tool used for prying. He had put these observations together with the fact that the office lock showed no damage and arrived at a conclusion he had written in his notebook and then done nothing with. He said, "I knew something was wrong. I did not speak because I told myself I had no proof. But the truth is that I did not speak because I was not certain enough of my own judgment to put it against Edmund Voss's certainty in a room where Edmund Voss was the authority. That is a different thing from not having proof. That is a failure of will, and I have had 23 days to understand the difference clearly." Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said she needed him to tell her everything he had observed at Coldridge since the second day. Not conclusions, not interpretations, only what he had seen and heard in the order it had happened. She needed the sequence because sequence was the only way to see which events caused, which other events, and causation was the only thing that would matter when the storm was over, and the roads reopened, and the world outside this chamber had to account for what had been done. They worked through it for the better part of a day. The account that emerged was more complete than either of them had separately. Elston had the observations Mason's behavior in the days following the accusation, the urgency with which Mason had reacted to Clem Briggs's smoke report, the way Edmund had moved to add Clara's supposed debt to the camp ledger within 48 hours of her expulsion. He had these things in his notebook, dated and sequenced, the careful record of a man who had trained himself to notice without yet learning to act. Clara had the structural understanding, the pattern she had seen in the ledger figures before her expulsion, the way the camp's supply pricing had almost certainly been adjusted in the weeks following the theft, the discrepancy between the amount Edmund had publicly attributed to the missing payroll and the amount she calculated had actually been in the box. Together, these two bodies of knowledge told a story that neither could have told alone. Not a story of elaborate planning. A simpler and therefore more damning story, the story of a man who had made a desperate choice in the middle of the night, succeeded in displacing the consequences onto someone without power to resist them, and then watched as the people around him chose convenience over examination. Because examination is difficult and convenience is always available. Clara took the largest piece of mica she had and wrote the timeline on it with charcoal, working slowly and with care. Every event she could date with confidence. Every observation that could be corroborated. The sequence of the office key, the payroll box, the script in her sewing kit. Mason's testimony, the 3 unanswered questions, the untested lock, the unchecked window ground. Then Harlon Dyer's silence. Then Edmund's ledger adjustment. Then the price increases. Then Mason's reaction to the smoke report. When she was finished, she looked at it for a long time. The story was there. It was complete and coherent and required no interpretation beyond what the facts themselves provided. The only thing it lacked was physical evidence, something that could be held and examined and could not be explained away by the authority of the men whose authority it contradicted. She told Elston what to carry when he left. The temperature records, the system notes, the mica timeline, a complete written account in her own hand of the night the payroll box disappeared, rendered in sequence. She also told him something else. She told him that Harlon Dyer had almost certainly been keeping his own records, and that if those records showed what she believed they showed, then the physical evidence would follow. Evidence of that kind does not disappear. It is absorbed into a system, and when a system fails, everything it absorbed comes back to the surface. Elston asked how she could be certain the physical evidence still existed. Clara said she was not certain. She said certainty was a luxury she had not been in a position to afford for some time. What she had instead was the understanding that Mason Voss had hidden the payroll box somewhere, and that he had hidden it at speed and under pressure, and that people who hide things under pressure generally make choices based on proximity rather than wisdom. The weighing shed, she said, the only structure in the western section that had not been in regular use, the only structure whose floor could be accessed without tools visible to anyone passing by. The structure she would have chosen in his position, which meant it was the structure she did not believe he had been clever enough to improve upon. Elston left on the morning of the 26th day when the storm had eased enough to make the eastern ridge route passable. Clara assembled his load with the efficiency of a person who has thought carefully about what matters: the mica timeline, the temperature records, the written account, the system diagram of the lower passage. She handed him the long pole she used for clearing the ventilation shaft. He looked at it and then at her. She said she had already made another one. She had made it the previous afternoon. He stood at the entrance for a moment. He said he would tell them the truth. He asked if she wanted him to tell them she had saved his life. Clara considered the question. Then she shook her head. "Tell them the truth," she said. "Tell it in the order it happened." He nodded. Then he bent low and entered the passage, and the sound of his movement faded into the diminishing storm, and Clara was alone again. Not with emptiness, but with the solitude that belongs to people who are fully occupied with necessary work. She picked up the rawhide lashing she had set down and returned to the sleeping frame. What happened at Coldridge over the following 3 days happened without her. The storm's damage was extensive. One section of the bunkhouse roof had lost its tar paper sheeting to the wind and required immediate repair. Harlon Dyer organized the work with the efficiency of a man most useful in emergencies. He sent teams to assess structural damage in every building, prioritizing by urgency. The team assigned to the western storage buildings reached the old weighing shed on the morning of the 28th day. The shed's north wall had taken a hit from a falling pine, not catastrophically, but with enough force to transmit a lateral load through the wall framing into the floor structure. One primary floor joist had twisted slightly at its connection point. The floorboard above that connection had been pushed upward by the twisting, not far, perhaps 2 inches at one end, but enough to break the seal of compression that had been holding it flat for months. Harlon Dyer was in the shed when one of the workers pointed to the raised board. He looked at it. He told the workers to step back. He knelt and examined the edge of the board without touching it. He saw the fresh wood at the gap where it had lifted. He saw the gap was wider at one end, which suggested the board had been lifted from that end at some point before the storm and replaced without being properly refastened. He looked at the pry marks at the far end. They were not new. They had been made before the storm, before the winter, made with an iron tool carefully, but not perfectly, by someone working in low light and under pressure. He lifted the board. In the space below, resting on packed earth between 2 floor joists, the walnut payroll box with its brass lock intact and one corner of its lid bearing the marks of a tool that had been worked into the gap without breaking the lock. Beside it, a broken section of iron bar with splinters of walnut embedded in the metal. Laid flat against the side of the box, 2 pieces of paper gambling debt notes signed in Mason Voss's hand, addressed to 2 teamsters by name, dated the night before the payroll box was reported missing. Caught on a nail head at the upper edge of the space, a small triangle of canvas fabric from a coat. Harlon did not move for a long time. The storm had done what 26 days of human investigation had not. It had loaded the north wall of the weighing shed, twisted a floor joist, lifted a floorboard, and exposed everything Mason Voss had buried there on a night in October when he believed that cold and distance and his father's authority would be sufficient to bury a 20-year-old woman alongside the evidence of what he had done. The very storm Edmund had relied upon to finish Clara had finished his son instead. Harlon picked up the payroll box and carried it across the camp to the mess hall. He set it on the table in the center of the room, the same table where Clara Ashwood had stood alone before the entire camp, and asked 3 questions that no one had answered. He set it down and stepped back and said nothing for a moment, because some moments require silence before they can be properly addressed. Edmund Voss looked at the box and at Harlon's face and at the debt notes and at the broken iron bar and at the triangle of canvas fabric, and he tried one final argument. His voice was steady. He said it was possible that Clara and Mason had worked together, that Clara might have passed the spare key to Mason, that the hiding place might have been agreed upon in advance, that the evidence beneath the floor proved Mason's involvement, but did not necessarily exonerate Clara. He said this with this conviction of a man who has spent 17 years making arguments that were accepted because he was the one making them, and who has not yet fully registered that the room has changed. The older of the two teamsters who had won Mason's money walked into the room from the doorway where he had been listening and said without particular drama that Mason Voss had paid his gambling debt before first light on the morning the payroll box was reported missing. He had paid in silver coins. The amount matched within a few dollars of what was now visibly absent from the box's interior. The second teamster nodded once from the doorway. That was all it took. The argument lasted less than 10 minutes after that. Mason was gone from camp. He had taken a horse from the stable sometime in the early morning hours before the box was found, which indicated that Elston Crane's return to Coldridge the previous evening had communicated something to Mason that the assembled evidence now confirmed. He had a head start of perhaps 8 hours on roads that were still partially blocked by storm debris. Clem Briggs, who knew this country in every season and condition, said without being asked that the southern bridge station was the only viable crossing point given the current state of the roads. He said this looking at a point in the middle distance, rather than at the people in the room. Sheriff Amos Reed had been waiting in the valley settlement for the roads to reopen, and he arrived at Coldridge on the afternoon of the 28th day with the patience of a man accustomed to weather-setting his schedule. He found Mason Voss at the southern bridge station on roads that turned out to be less passable than Mason had hoped. In the saddlebag of the tired horse Mason was riding, Reed found 2 Silver Creek payroll vouchers that had not been in Mason's possession before the night the payroll box disappeared. The law arrived after the storm. The evidence had been waiting since October. Edmund Voss made the journey to Ravenfall on the 29th day. He came with Elston, Crane, Harlon, Dyer, and Sheriff Amos Reed. He did not bring workers or loggers or the apparatus of authority he normally moved through the world with. The weather had broken into the hard, clear cold that follows major storms in the Idaho Territory, brutal but honest, a cold that announces itself without pretense. The sky was the deep, unambiguous blue that only exists at altitude in winter. They came through the lower passage one at a time, bending at the waist, navigating the places where the stone required it. At the inner entrance, each of them had to bow his head beneath the canvas baffle that Clara had hung 18 inches inside the lower opening on the 13th day, because the wind pattern at that entrance required it at exactly that height, not to make a point, but because function demanded it. Edmund was a tall man. He had walked through every door in Coldridge without thinking about the door. He bent his head and entered the space she had made. Clara was seated near the hearth, working a length of rawhide through a repair on the snare mechanism she had been meaning to address for several days. A small task specific requiring attention. The kind of work that continues regardless of what else is happening, because the work does not stop being necessary because other things are also happening. She did not stand up. Sheriff Reed spoke first. He was a deliberate man in his 50s who had developed over many years in this territory a deep skepticism of simple explanations and a corresponding respect for people who insisted on complicated ones when the evidence required it. He summarized the situation with the economy of a man who respects other people's time, the evidence recovered from beneath the weighing shed floor, Mason's flight and apprehension at the bridge station, the debt notes, the matching silver, the lock that had never been forced. Clara's name was clear. The contract Edmund had torn on the second day was not valid under territorial law, which required a formal finding of guilt before the termination of a labor agreement. No formal finding had been made, only a camp owner's unilateral declaration in a mess hall. The debt recorded against her name had no legal basis. It was void. Edmund stood near the back wall of the chamber while Reed spoke. He looked at the stillness of his own face reflected in nothing. There were no mirrors here, only stone, and arranged what he could. He had the look of a man watching something he built being taken apart. Not with rage, because Edmund Voss was not a man of rage, but something in the set of his shoulders carried the weight of a system collapsing in a way that his face has always declined to show. He looked at the charcoal columns on the wall. He looked at the sleeping enclosure, the ventilation pole, the elevated storage, the drainage trench, the 3 tinder containers. He looked at what a 20-year-old woman had built with a tinderbox and 2 serviceable hides and a deerhide map, and the same careful attention to cause and effect that he had always assumed belonged exclusively to men of his station. When Reed finished, Edmund said that he had acted on the evidence available to him at the time. He said the decision he had made in the mess hall on the second day was the decision any reasonable man in his position would have made given what he knew. Clara looked up from the rawhide for the first time. She did not raise her voice. The stone chamber carried quiet speech with complete clarity, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about it. She said 3 questions. The lock showed no damage from forcing. The ground outside the office window had not been examined. The spare key had not been verified as unused. She had asked these 3 questions in the mess hall on the second day in front of every worker and every visitor at Coldridge, and Edmund Voss had refused to address any of them, not because he lacked the means to investigate, but because investigation was not the outcome he required. The chamber was quiet. Then Harlon Dyer, who had been standing near the entrance to the sleeping enclosure with his eyes on the temperature records on the wall, spoke without turning around. He said he had made his own choice on the second day, that he had seen the pattern in the numbers before the storm hit and felt the wrongness of them and done nothing with it until he had no other option. He said he had stood in the mess hall and heard 3 specific questions asked and felt the weight of them being unanswered and chosen the convenient conclusion regardless. He said that choosing the easy explanation when a harder and truer one is available is not the same as being deceived. It is a choice. A man who makes that choice has to own it, and he had been owning it in the privacy of his own thoughts for 26 days, and it was heavier than he had expected it to be. He said this quietly, still facing the wall, in the way that men sometimes say true things they have been working up to for a long time. Nobody in the chamber argued with him. Nobody could. Elston Crane stood near the back of the chamber. He had been silent through the entire exchange. Now he crossed to the wall and stood before it, looking at the entries. Not at all of them. At the ones from the early days, days 1 through 3, when the system was still failing and being rebuilt and failing again and being rebuilt better. He looked at the day 2 entry, which was sparse outside temperature food inventory, 1 failed fire attempt. Nothing else. Because on day 2, Clara had been focused entirely on surviving the immediate problem and had not yet developed the language for recording the larger situation she was in. He touched the wall just below that entry, not the entry itself, the blank stone below it, the place where an observation made on the second day in a mess hall 14 miles away might have been recorded if he had been a different kind of man at the time. He did not touch the wall itself. He had not earned that. He turned and looked at Clara, and she looked at him, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say that the look did not already contain. Clara returned to the rawhide. She said that she was managing well and did not require anything further. Edmund stood in the chamber a moment longer. He looked once more at the wall of records, 29 days, every temperature and every wood bundle and every system adjustment and every day count held in charcoal on stone that would carry those marks long after everyone present was gone. Then he turned and walked to the lower passage. At the entrance, he stopped. The canvas baffle hung at the height Clara had set it on the 13th day, measured against her own forearm, cut to function, not to make a statement. Edmund was a tall man who had spent 17 years walking through every door in his camp without adjusting himself to accommodate the door. He bent his head. He moved through the passage 1 step at a time, bowing in the places where the ceiling required it, and emerged into the hard winter light where the falls moved in their frozen frame, and the sky was that absolute, unambiguous blue. He straightened his back. He stood in the cold. He began the walk down the mountain. The man who had decided where Clara Ashwood belonged, who had stood at the head of his mess hall and torn her contract and sent her into the night, had just been required to bow his head to leave a place she had created with her own hands. There was no ceremony attached to this, no audience and no declaration, only the simple physics of a passage built to a height determined by function and a tall man navigating it. No further judgment was necessary. The bowing was the judgment. Harlon Dyer was the last to leave. He stood at the entrance for a moment after Reed and Elston had gone through. He looked at Clara, who was working the rawhide lashing with the same attention she brought to everything that mattered. He said he was sorry, not in the elaborate way that men sometimes apologize when they are more concerned with being forgiven than with acknowledging what they have done, but in the plain way, 2 words direct, carrying the full weight of what they meant without decoration. She looked at him. She accepted it without diminishing it or inflating it. It was what it was, and it was enough for what it was. He bent his head beneath the baffle and was gone. Clara sat alone in the chamber for a while after their footsteps had faded. The fire burned at the level she had built it to. The smoke rose through the shaft she had cleared on the third day. The stones under her bedding held the warmth they had been given. Every system she had built was running exactly as she had designed it to run. She looked at the day 29 entry on the wall. Then she drew the line for day 30 and left the space beside it blank because tomorrow would require its own record. Harlon Dyer returned to Silver Creek when the roads fully opened in late March. Before he left Coldridge, he came to Ravenfall and sat with Clara in the hard early spring cold outside the lower entrance and laid between them a bank draft representing the full amount incorrectly recorded as her debt, plus the sum by which the camp's supply prices had been inflated during the months of the investigation, calculated per worker and reconstituted as a sum owed specifically to her. It was careful and somewhat complicated accounting. She recognized the care in it. That spring, Harlon wrote a letter to the Territorial Land Office requesting that the labor contract system operating at Coldridge Timber Camp be reviewed for compliance with territorial statutes. He did not sign it with his name. He signed it as a concerned party with direct knowledge of the relevant records. He never told anyone he had written it. It was not the kind of thing a man does for recognition. It was the kind of thing a man does because the alternative is to spend the rest of his life being the person who chose the easy explanation twice. Clara broke ground for the cabin on the high bench above the falls in the second week of April, when the frost had come sufficiently out of the upper soil to allow digging. She had chosen the site with the same care she brought to everything for drainage, for wind shelter, for the angle of winter sun, for proximity to the spring. The deerhide map had marked with its wavy circle symbol. She did not choose it for proximity to Coldridge. She chose it for proximity to the mountain she understood. The stone chamber behind Ravenfall became what it had always been, which was what the people who built it had intended: a winter storehouse, a storm shelter, a place for records and tools, and the kind of knowledge that accumulates slowly and needs a stable location to accumulate in. Elston Crane came back in the spring with careful copies of the deerhide map, the original symbols reproduced as accurately as his draftsmanship allowed, and beside each symbol in his precise hand, a note drawn from Clara's accounts of what each marking had led her to find and how it had functioned in practice. The map said where. Clara's notes said why and how. Together, they carried more than either held alone. Clem Briggs came in May and spent 3 days going through the map, with both of them identifying the oldest symbols as Shoshone winter travel notation, a system developed over generations of inhabiting this range that encoded in compressed visual form more practical knowledge about surviving an Idaho winter than most people accumulated in a lifetime. He identified a second layer of additions made in a different hand with slightly different materials as belonging to trappers who had found the chamber in the 1870s, and a third layer sparse, mostly marginal, in a hand that carried the initials M.A. and a date of November 1871. Someone had been here before Clara, had needed what the mountain held, had learned what was learnable, had left what she could, had trusted the place to hold it until the next person came. The three of them agreed without needing to discuss it at length that the location of the chamber would not be shared beyond the circle of people who already knew it. Some knowledge survives because it is protected from those who would extract it rather than honor it. The school that Elston Crane established in the hollow that following autumn was a modest affair. One room donated lumber, a stove that required patience, and a specific technique to draw properly in cold weather. He taught reading and arithmetic and the geography of the territory. He also taught, because it seemed to him that it belonged alongside the rest, how to read a map that uses symbols rather than words, how to test what you believe against what you can observe before accepting either as fact, how to keep a record that distinguishes between what you know and what you have concluded from what you know, because those are different categories, and confusing them is how people end up in rooms believing things that have not been examined. Clara came to the school twice a month through that first winter. She sat in the back. She listened to Elston teach. After the formal lesson ended, she stayed and answered questions about specific practical matters. How to determine if a fire is drafting correctly before you add the main fuel. Why tinder should be stored in more than one location, and what that principle applies to beyond firemaking. How a body loses heat and in what order, and what that sequence tells you about what to address first. Why keeping warmth matters more than making warmth. She answered these questions the same way she recorded things on the wall of the stone chamber, plainly in sequence without embellishment, because the information itself was the point. and anything added to it was taking up space that the information needed. The children listened with the complete attention that children give to people who are telling them things they can sense are actually true. Marvel Holt came in the first warm week of May, making the walk from Coldridge alone, on a morning when the lower trails were finally passable. She carried the heavy canvas-lined coat that had belonged to her husband, the coat she had lifted from its peg in the mess hall, and then been stopped before she could deliver it, folded carefully in a canvas sack she had waterproofed with pine pitch against the spring mud. Clara came down to meet her on the lower trail. They stood in the thin spring sun and looked at each other for a moment, the way people look at each other when a great deal has happened, and most of it doesn't need to be said. Marvel handed her the coat. Clara took it and felt the weight of it, the weight of the canvas and the wool lining and the quality of the workmanship, and also the other weight, the weight of all the months it had hung on its peg through the winter, waiting for this moment. She did not put it on. She carried it inside and hung it on the wooden peg she had driven into the wall of the new cabin beside the hides that had kept her alive through 29 days in the mountain. Nobody had the authority to take it down. Nobody ever would. On the wall behind Ravenfall, the charcoal entries remained. Stone is patient with marks made on it. The lines do not fade the way ink fades or the way memory fades in people who have lived long enough to accumulate things they would prefer not to carry. They simply stay held in the mineral surface that has held them since the day they were made. Day 7. Outside 18 below. Sleeping space 52 degrees. One bundle. Smoke clean, hides dry. The record did not describe how Clara had felt on the 7th night. It did not describe the quality of the silence in the chamber after she wrote those numbers, or the satisfaction available only to people who have solved a difficult problem with limited resources and have the data to prove it. It did not describe what she had been thinking about, or whether she had believed in the private interior of that night that the system she was building would hold long enough to matter. It recorded only what she had done. This was why it lasted. Beside the Day 7 entry, the bone needle she had found on the chamber floor on the first night rested in its small notch in the stone set there, as acknowledgement of the person who had left it, and the knowledge they had carried, and the trust they had placed in the mountain to hold what they left until someone else came who would know what to do with it. Beside the needle, Marvel Holt's coat hung on its peg. Not as a monument, not as a symbol of anything beyond itself, a warm coat, well-made, belonging now without question to the person who had received it. Outside, the falls moved in their seasonal rhythm, full and loud in spring, slower through summer, lacing with ice again as the altitude reasserted itself in autumn, freezing to their winter architecture of suspended white, when the cold came back, as it always came back, as it would keep coming back long after every person who had passed through this story had passed through everything else as well. The mountain went about its business, which is the business of mountains, the slow, indifferent work of weather and stone and time operating without interest in the affairs of the people who moved through it. Clara Ashwood moved through it with the knowledge she had earned there. It had been enough since the 7th day, when the numbers on the wall proved that the warmth she had built with her own hands could hold against the cold that the world outside had sent to finish her. The cold had not finished her. The numbers said so. The wall held them. And the mountain, which had held the knowledge of everyone who came before her and would hold her own knowledge for whoever came next, kept its counsel as it always had, patient, permanent, and entirely without interest in who deserved what. It simply recorded what had been done, as did the wall, as did she. That was enough. It had always been enough.